You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This episode is a little different. Today I'd like to talk about ethics. I want to talk a bit about the problem of morality. And I'd like to address the question of how to find freedom within the context of all of the moral arguments that we are constantly surrounded by. So I'm going to look at some different approaches to morality, how various people have responded to the moral arguments that are all around us in everyday life. And then I'd like to talk about what I think is really going on with morality, what morality is really all about. And lastly, I'd like to talk about some ideas for how to find a way through all of the confusion and misinformation and muddled thinking around the topic of morality. So as a bit of a background to this episode, I've just released my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur. And in that book, there's a chapter on finding your purpose in business. And as part of the discussion about the whole question of how to identify the purpose of your business as an entrepreneur, I mentioned in the book the importance of your own code of ethics in that choice of a purpose for your business. And a lot of the beta readers who read the book questioned that and asked me to provide more information about what I thought about ethics for entrepreneurs and personal ethics and what valid ethics are or how to choose ethics. And these are all great questions and really interesting, but it's a different discussion to what I was talking about in the book Becoming an Entrepreneur. But I do think that it's a very important topic for anyone interested in thinking for themselves. I've thought a lot about ethics and read a lot about ethics over the years, and I do think it fits in with the general scope of the voluntary life, which is about ways of finding freedom in your own life, because we can't avoid the question of morality and ethics. So that's what this episode is going to be about. And in this episode, what I want to do is focus on the question of what morality is really about. So just to provide a bit of background, we are all surrounded by moral justifications and moral rules in day-to-day life. And by moral rules, I mean rules of what is considered to be acceptable or good behavior, or what is considered to be unacceptable or bad behavior. So we're always hearing arguments about what is good and what is bad, or what is considered to be acceptable things to do or not acceptable things to do. And we hear these kinds of arguments from our parents as children, from teachers, from religious leaders, from political leaders, from intellectuals. We see them enacted in law within the societies that we live in. So we're completely surrounded by morality the whole time. And people take morality incredibly seriously. People die for moral arguments. They're willing to go and fight wars, kill other people, or give up their own freedom if they believe that there are valid moral reasons to do so. And regardless of the particular approach that people take to morality, it seems to be fairly universal that everybody wants to consider themselves good. They may define what good is in their own terms, and they may have moral justifications for why their particular type of behavior is correct or good or right or the best way to behave given the circumstances. However they want to define it, everyone wants to feel that their behavior is justified, and people tend to justify their own behavior with arguments, and those arguments tend to be moral arguments. And it's certainly one of those subject areas that, to use a psychological term, is very triggering. So discussions of morality tend to get extremely emotive and very tense and very emotionally charged, which is unsurprising because ultimately, when you're talking about morality, you're usually talking about people telling you what to do, or you telling other people what to do. So here is just a flavor of some of the ideas floating around about morality. There is the view that morality is all just a sham. It's an exploitation device used by some people to extract resources from others or to get other people to do what they want. Maybe it's even an invention of the ruling classes to subdue and pacify those that they rule over. There's also the view that given that morality is a sham, a trick or a ploy, then one approach to morality is to simply do whatever you want, to give up on any idea of moral rules per se, and simply do whatever you choose to or whatever you can get away with. In that approach, there really is no such thing as a valid moral rule. There's just whatever you choose to do. And another aspect of that approach might be to revel in having no constraints on your own behavior, or cynically not expecting anyone else to constrain their own behavior. Then there's an approach to morality which is based on authority. And that idea is that morality is derived from some given set of rules. So that might be a religious idea. For example, the rules are given in an ancient religious book that has been passed down to us by priests, and that are ultimately, the validity is ultimately derived from a god. That's one type of appeal to authority for morality, but it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. There's also the appeal to the authority of secular rules. So that would be, for example, the idea that the laws of any given society, for example, in a democracy, that those laws are valid because they are given to us by so-called representatives, and that their validity is derived from the principle of majority rule that led to the representatives writing the laws in the first place. Then there's another approach to morality, which is the approach of morality based on consequences, that although we may not be able to tell what rules are valid in the outset, we can experiment and see what the effects of implementing various moral rules are, and then we can choose those rules that we like the consequences of. And we maybe choose the consequences of those moral rules that seem to offer the most happiness to the most people in some kind of utilitarian way. Another aspect of that kind of approach is to say that morality is all purely subjective, and there's no particular way to choose one moral rule over another, except in terms of its consequences. And if we can agree that we want certain specific consequences, then it may be that in order to get those consequences, we have to implement certain types of moral rules. There's an argument that some people make, which is that moral rules are ultimately valid if they feel right. If your intuition tells you that a rule feels that it ought to be okay, then that's a guide as to whether or not the rule actually is okay. There are huge problems with all of those approaches to understanding morality. They're all ultimately very confused responses to morality. So I want to give you my understanding of how to make sense of morality. I think the only way to make sense of moral rules is to have a clear definition of the purpose of a moral rule for all the people who are supposed to follow it. If we have a clear, shared understanding of what the purpose of moral rules are, then we can have criteria to evaluate whether or not any particular moral rule is valid. Because it's certainly true that there are many moral arguments that are invalid, in the sense that they are incoherent or self-contradictory, or most of all, simply designed to exploit you. Because people take morality so seriously, there are many people who use moral arguments to try and exploit others. But not all morality is invalid, and not all morality is simply a ploy to try and get you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't do in order for the person who's proposing the moral rule to exploit you. There is a genuine need for moral rules, and that's really what I've been trying to get to in this podcast episode, is to talk about what the genuine need for morality among people is. And it's really very simple. The purpose of morality is to enable people to live peacefully together. It's to avoid conflict. People need to agree shared rules to live together in order to avoid conflict. And the reason that we need rules in order to live together is because we have scarce resources. So we share this one world that we live on at the moment, and in the world we have limited resources. We have a limited amount of stuff. Maybe in future we'll live on other worlds too, but even then we'll only have the scarce resources of those worlds that we do live on. So if we want to live together peacefully, the immediate question arises of what do we do about the resources? What do we do about the stuff? And how do we prevent ourselves from fighting over it? This is the purpose of morality, is to provide rules that enable people to live peacefully, to coexist peacefully within the world of scarce resources that we find ourselves in. Scarcity leads to conflict. The more scarce resources are, the more people tend to fight. So there are two things that we can do in order to live peacefully together. One is to reduce the scarcity by economic development, and that comes through trade and entrepreneurship and science and all of those good things. But even if we increase the amount of stuff that we have, usable goods in the world, we never really escape the scarcity of resources, and there's still always the question of who owns what and who gets to control what, who gets to do things with some stuff and not other stuff, and so forth. And consequently, we need rules about how to live together without conflict within the context of scarce resources that we might otherwise fight over. So that gives you a framework to use to construct morality for yourself. There's no point in defining rules of social conduct without having an objective in mind. And the framework that makes sense, both for a person proposing a moral rule and for anyone else who they expect to adopt the moral rule, is this framework of how do we live together peacefully in a world of scarce resources? What constitutes rules that enable us to live peacefully together? The purpose of morality is peace between individuals and ultimately between all individuals. So therefore the purpose of morality is world peace. So what does this mean for you on an everyday level? Because this is all super high level abstract stuff. But bringing it back down to the everyday, having a clearly understandable purpose for morality gives you a framework to reconstruct morality for yourself. It gives you a framework to decide for yourself which rules are moral and which rules are immoral. Because you can validate a moral rule against the question, is this rule in line with the ultimate purpose of morality, which is to provide for shared rules of behavior that allow us to live together peacefully within the context of scarce resources. Now, in order to evaluate those rules, we do need criteria. We need to think about, well, what kind of rules would enable that, and how would those rules actually work? And if you're interested, I think that will be the next part in this discussion about morality. What kind of criteria can you use for yourself in order to consciously construct your own ethical code and consciously evaluate all the ethical arguments that are presented to you to identify whether or not any particular rule is a valid moral rule or invalid? And in this way, you can have your own moral compass. You can judge for yourself whether any particular law that is on the statute books of any country that you find yourself in is a moral law or an immoral one. Now, whether or not you choose to comply with an immoral law is another question, and that's a practical question because breaking the law has consequences. But before you even get to that, you need to know for yourself whether a particular law is moral or immoral and be able to be clear in your own mind about the status of any law in any country that you're in. Having your own moral compass and your own framework means that you are independent of any argument from authority that is given to you, either from religious people or anybody else. You can determine for yourself whether or not moral rules are valid using an independent framework with an ultimate purpose that's valid for every single person that wants to live peacefully with other humans. And by the way, anybody who argues against living peacefully, anyone who engages in argument to explain to you how living peacefully isn't the ultimate aim of life, is actually engaged in a contradiction by making that argument. But that's a topic for another time. I can go into more explanation about that. The point at the moment is that you will have your own independent framework for assessing ethics. And the best thing of all about that is it makes you highly resistant to exploitation by others. It gives you a critical perspective on any rule that is put forward and enables you to define good and bad for yourself. And it also gives you a framework that means that you would have the ability to live peacefully with all other people because you have a framework of understanding what that involves. Being able to think for yourself always makes you dangerous to the powers that be in this world. But the most dangerous type of thinking for yourself of all is moral thinking for yourself. So I think this is an absolutely fundamental and very important topic, because having your own moral compass and your own ability to have clarity about your ethics enables you to be independent from people who want to exploit you. The big question, though, is how do you develop that framework? What criteria do you use to evaluate moral rules and to identify which ethical rules are scams attempting to exploit you and which ethical rules are actually in line with the ultimate purpose of ethics or morality, which is to enable humans to live together peacefully within the context of scarce resources. Now, if you're interested in that, then let me know and I will do more in this series. In the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts about this. I'm very interested in your feedback. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.